The millionaire woman gave a fortune to the homeless woman in court. She revealed a secret that left everyone shocked. Patricia Sinclair watched the city of San Francisco through the large windows of her penthouse. The morning sun bathed the skyscrapers in golden light, creating a surreal contrast with the shadows of the slums that spread out on the outskirts. Her brown eyes, framed by premature wrinkles, reflected a mixture of melancholy and determination. With a sigh, she moved away from the window, her footsteps echoing on the immaculate marble floor. The apartment, decorated with expensive works of art and designer furniture, looked more like a museum than a home. Patricia ran her fingers over the polished surface of a coffee table, feeling the cold of the glass against her skin. "Ma'am," called a soft voice. It was Maria, her housekeeper for over 2 decades. "Breakfast is served." Patricia nodded, following Maria into the dining room. The table was set for one person, as usual. Fresh fruit, artisan breads, and a steaming cup of coffee awaited her. She sat down, picking up the day's newspaper. The headlines screamed of inequality, violence, and the alarming increase in the street population. Patricia felt a lump form in her throat. Words and numbers danced before her eyes, but one fact stood out. More than 30,000 people lived on the streets of San Francisco. Suddenly, the coffee cup in her hands seemed to weigh a ton. Patricia put it back on the saucer with a sharp clank, startling Maria. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" asked the housekeeper, concern evident in her voice. Patricia forced a smile. "Yes, Maria, just thinking." But everything wasn't fine. For weeks now, since the anniversary of her parents' death, Patricia had felt a growing restlessness. Her life of luxury and isolation was beginning to suffocate her. The walls of the penthouse, once a refuge, now seemed like a golden prison. Determined, Patricia stood up abruptly. "Maria, please call my driver. I need to leave." Minutes later, Patricia was in the back seat of her limousine, watching the city go by from the window. The driver, used to the usual destinations, fine restaurants, art galleries, business meetings, was surprised when she asked to go downtown. The streets became increasingly congested as they approached the heart of San Francisco. Patricia observed, with a mixture of fascination and horror, the pulsating life of the metropolis. Street vendors, hurried executives, and amazed tourists mingled on the sidewalks. It was then that she saw them, a group of homeless people huddled under the marquee of an abandoned building. Men, women, even children, all sharing the same look of despair and resignation. "Stop the car," Patricia ordered, her voice trembling slightly. The driver hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't think it's safe." "I told you to stop," she insisted, her voice now firm. Reluctantly, he obeyed. Patricia got out of the car, feeling the shock of the heat and pollution. Her high heels echoed on the sidewalk as she approached the group. A woman not much younger than Patricia looked up. Her face was marked by time and hardship, but her eyes still shone with a spark of hope. "Do you have any change, ma'am?" the woman asked, her voice hoarse. Patricia froze. Suddenly, all her wealth seemed insignificant in the face of the human suffering in front of her. She reached into her purse, pulling out her entire wallet. "Here," she said, handing the wallet to the stunned woman. "Split it between you." The homeless woman, who Patricia would come to know was called Mariah Johnson, looked incredulously at the wallet in her hands. But that's too much, ma'am. We can't accept it." Patricia felt tears forming in her eyes. "Please accept it. It's the least I can do." At that moment, something changed inside Patricia Sinclair. The barriers she had erected over the years began to crumble. The pain and guilt she had been carrying since the death of her parents found a new purpose. Back in the limousine, Patricia picked up her phone. "Claire," she said as soon as her lawyer answered, "I need you to prepare the documents. I'm donating half my fortune to homeless assistance programs." On the other end of the line, Claire choked. "Patricia, are you sure? We're talking billions of dollars." "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," Patricia replied, her voice filled with emotion. In the days that followed, the news of Patricia Sinclair's donation spread like wildfire. Newspapers, television, social media, everyone was talking about the millionaire who had decided to donate half her fortune to help those in need. For Mariah Johnson, the news brought a ray of hope. Sitting in a temporary shelter, she listened intently to the radio announcing the details of the donation. "This could change everything," Mariah whispered to herself, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a better future. Meanwhile, at the courthouse in San Francisco, preparations for the donation hearing were in full swing. Judges, lawyers, and assistants were running around, carrying piles of documents. Judge Roberto Mendez, known for his impartiality and rigor, was studying the case carefully. The magnitude of the donation and its social implications made this one of the most important cases of his career. Claire, Patricia's lawyer, worked tirelessly, preparing arguments and gathering evidence to ensure that her client's wishes were respected. She knew she would face fierce opposition from some members of the Sinclair family, who saw the donation as a threat to their lifestyle. As the day of the hearing approached, the tension in the city was palpable. Groups of activists gathered in front of the courthouse, holding placards in support of the donation. Across the street, a smaller but noisy group protested against what they called a waste of wealth. Patricia watched all this from her rooftop, feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to fight. For the first time in years, she felt she was doing something truly meaningful. The day before the hearing, Patricia did something she hadn't done for a long time. She prayed, not for herself, but for all the Mariahs around the world, hoping that her donation could bring a little light into their lives. The sun rose over San Francisco, marking the beginning of a new day, a day that promised to change many lives. Patricia Sinclair straightened her impeccable suit, took a deep breath, and left her apartment, ready to face whatever fate had in store for her in court. The city waited expectantly for this story of generosity and redemption to unfold. The John Madison Forum in downtown San Francisco was buzzing with activity that morning. Journalists flocked to the entrance steps, cameras and microphones in hand, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the protagonists of what promised to be one of the most intriguing cases of the year. Patricia Sinclair emerged from her limousine, immediately surrounded by flashes and shouted questions. Her normally composed face betrayed a slight tremor of nervousness. Claire, her lawyer, guided her through the crowd, arm protectively around her client's shoulders. "No comment," Claire repeated firmly, making her way through the reporters. On the other side of the square, almost unnoticed by the media, Mariah Johnson arrived on foot. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes wide at the grandeur of the building and the tumult that surrounded it. She was wearing simple but clean clothes, provided by the shelter where she was staying temporarily. Inside the courtroom, the noise was almost deafening. The courtroom was packed, with representatives from various charitable organizations, curious onlookers, and of course members of the Sinclair family, many of whom cast furious glances in Patricia's direction. Judge Roberto Mendez entered the room, and a respectful silence ensued. His stern face scanned the audience before settling on Patricia. "We are here today," he began, his deep voice echoing through the room, "to assess the legality and implications of the donation proposed by Ms. Patricia Sinclair. An unprecedented donation in our country, both in value and potential social impact." Patricia straightened up in her chair, feeling the weight of all the stares on her. Claire gently squeezed her arm, a silent gesture of support. "Ms. Sinclair," continued the judge, "could you explain to us, in your own words, what led you to make this decision?" Patricia stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I have spent much of my life surrounded by luxury and privilege, while all around me thousands of people struggled daily to survive. It was only recently that I realized the true weight of this disparity." She paused, her eyes scanning the room until they found Mariah, sitting discreetly at the back. "I saw up close the suffering of those who don't have a roof over their heads, who don't know where their next meal will come from, and I realized that I had the power to make a difference, not just with occasional small donations, but with a truly significant change." A murmur went through the room. Patricia continued, "This donation isn't just about money. It's about social responsibility. about using the resources we have to create a lasting positive impact on our society. Judge Mendez nodded, his face impassive. Thank you, Ms. Sinclair. Now, I'd like to hear from the representatives of the charitable organizations that will be affected by this donation. One by one, leaders of various NGOs stood up to speak. They talked about housing programs, job training, medical assistance. Each painted a vivid picture of how Patricia's donation could transform thousands of lives. Meanwhile, Mariah watched everything with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she sensed that something important was about to happen. After hours of testimony, Judge Mendez turned again to Patricia. Miss Sinclair, your generosity is commendable. However, I must ask, have you fully considered the personal implications of this decision? This donation will represent a drastic change in your lifestyle. Patricia smiled a sad but determined smile. Your Honor, what will change is only the superfluous. What really matters, the ability to make a difference, will only increase. It was at this moment that Mariah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the marble floor. All eyes turned to her. Excuse me, Your Honor, she said, her voice shaky but determined. I have something to say. Judge Mendez frowned, surprised by the interruption. And you are? Mariah Johnson, Your Honor. I'm one of the people who would benefit from this donation, but there are more. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'm Patricia Sinclair's cousin. A collective shock ran through the room. Patricia turned abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. What? She whispered in disbelief. Claire, the lawyer, immediately stood up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have no evidence to support that claim. Judge Mendez raised his hand, silencing the room. Ms. Johnson, this is a serious allegation. Do you have any evidence to support what you say? Mariah trembled visibly, but her gaze remained steady. I do, Your Honor. I have a birth certificate and old family photos. I didn't want to mention it. I didn't come here to cause trouble or ask for anything for myself, but listening to Patricia talk, I felt I had to tell the truth. The room erupted in agitated conversations. Patricia remained motionless, her face a mask of shock and confusion. Claire immediately began whispering furiously to her client, while the other lawyers present stood up, demanding verification of Mariah's allegations. Judge Mendez banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Silence, silence in the courtroom. When he finally managed to quieten the room, he turned to Mariah. Ms. Johnson, hand over the documents you mentioned to the bailiff. We'll do an immediate check. While the documents were being examined, Patricia couldn't take her eyes off Mariah. Long-buried memories began to surface. The face of a smiling girl at a family picnic. A distant cousin who had disappeared after a tragedy. Claire, sensing her client's agitation, leaned towards her. Patricia, don't jump to conclusions. We'll check all this out carefully. But the lawyer could already see the gears turning in her mind. If this family connection was true, the implications for the case would be enormous. It could be both a complication and an opportunity. After what seemed like an eternity, the bailiff returned with the documents, handing them to the judge along with a preliminary report. Judge Mendez examined them carefully, his face a mask of concentration. Finally, he looked around the room. After an initial check, it appears that there is indeed evidence to support Ms. Johnson's allegation. She is apparently a distant cousin of the Sinclair family. The courtroom erupted into chaos again. Patricia felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. How had she not known this? How had a member of her family ended up on the streets? Judge Mendez banged his gavel once more. Order! In light of this new information, I declare a recess. We will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. I hope that all parties will use this time to process these revelations and consider their implications. As the room emptied in a flurry of excited voices, Patricia and Mariah remained in their seats, their gazes locked on each other across the room. Two women, separated by circumstance and fate, now united by a revelation that promised to change everything. Claire watched the scene, her analytical mind already working on the possibilities and complications that this new information would bring. She knew that the Sinclair family history was about to be exposed, bringing long-buried secrets to light. The courtroom was empty now, except for Patricia, Mariah, and Claire. The silence was deafening, laden with unasked questions and unrevealed truths. Night fell over San Francisco, but sleep didn't come for Patricia Sinclair. In her penthouse apartment, she sat in the dark, her eyes fixed on the city below. The courtroom revelations echoed in her mind, unleashing an avalanche of long-suppressed memories. With a heavy sigh, Patricia stood up and walked over to a locked cabinet in the corner of her office. With trembling hands, she turned the dial of the safe, revealing a carved wooden box. Inside, old photos and yellowed newspaper clippings waited, guarding secrets from the past. Meanwhile, in a small hotel room provided by her new allies, Mariah Johnson was equally restless. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she held a faded photograph, her fingers tracing the outlines of smiling faces. On either side of the city, two women plunged into painful memories, reliving the day that changed everything. 20 years ago, the summer sun bathed the Sinclair mansion in golden light. Children's laughter echoed through the manicured garden, where the family gathered for the traditional summer picnic. Patricia, then 25, watched the scene with a distant smile. Her father, the patriarch Robert Sinclair, was discussing business with his brother, while her mother, Elizabeth, was arranging the dishes on the large checkered tablecloth. "Patty, come and play!" The excited voice belonged to Mariah, then 15, Patricia's second cousin. The teenager was running around the lawn with other children, her face lit up with the carefree joy of youth. Patricia shook her head, smiling. "Maybe later, Mari. I have to help Mom." The afternoon passed in an atmosphere of happiness and family togetherness. No one could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold. As the sun began to set, the guests said their goodbyes. The nuclear Sinclair family, Robert, Elizabeth, Patricia, and their younger brother Thomas, retreated into the mansion. It was then that the smell of smoke reached Patricia's nostrils. "Dad?" she called out, concern evident in her voice. "Do you feel that?" Robert frowned, sniffing the air. Suddenly, his eyes went wide. "Fire! Elizabeth, get the children!" Chaos ensued. The flames, which had apparently started in the east wing of the mansion, spread with terrifying speed. Thick smoke quickly filled the corridors, making it difficult to see and breathe. Patricia rushed into Thomas's room, finding the 10-year-old cowering under the bed. "Come on, Tommy. We've got to get out of here." Carrying her brother in her arms, Patricia struggled to find her way through the smoke. She could hear the desperate cries of her parents calling out to them. When they finally reached the garden, Patricia saw with horror that the flames had engulfed almost the entire mansion. Fire engines were arriving, sirens howling in the night. "Mom! Daddy!" Thomas shouted, struggling to free himself from Patricia's arms. That's when she saw it, two figures emerging from the smoke. For a moment, her heart leapt for joy. But as they got closer, Patricia realized that it wasn't her parents. It was Uncle James carrying an unconscious Mariah. "Patricia," James shouted, coughing violently. "Your parents, they—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The look in his eyes said it all. The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, flashing lights and muffled voices. Patricia found herself wrapped in a blanket, watching helplessly as the firefighters battled the flames that were consuming her home and her family. Thomas sobbed silently beside her, while Mariah, having regained consciousness, stared at the scene with eyes empty of shock. That was the last time Patricia saw Mariah. Back in the present, Patricia wiped away the tears that were silently streaming down her face. The guilt she had been carrying for 2 decades weighed even heavier now. How could she have lost contact with Mariah? How had she allowed her cousin to end up on the streets? On the other side of town, Mariah put the photo back in a worn bag. The image of a young Patricia smiling beside her was a bittersweet reminder of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. After the fire, Mariah's life spiraled. Her father, James, devastated by the loss of his brother and sister-in-law, plunged into alcoholism. Within a few years, they had lost everything. Mariah, then 18, found herself alone in the world, with no formal education and no means of support. The years on the streets had been tough, but somehow she had survived. And now, by some quirk of fate, she found herself back in the Sinclairs' orbit. Mariah wondered what tomorrow would bring. Part of her wanted to escape, to return to the anonymity of the streets she knew so well. But another part, a part she thought she had suffocated long ago, longed for connection, for family. In the penthouse, Patricia made a decision. Picking up the phone, she dialed Claire's number. "Claire, it's Claire. I need you to do something in the morning. Find out everything you can about what happened to Mariah Johnson over the last 20 years, and prepare the papers. I want to change the terms of the donation." On the other end of the line, Claire hesitated. "Patricia, are you sure? That could complicate things even more." "I'm sure," Patricia replied, her voice firm for the first time in days. "It's time to correct some of the mistakes of the past." Meanwhile, in court, Judge Roberto Mendez spent the evening poring over the Sinclair case files. What had begun as a simple hearing about a charitable donation was turning out to be a complex web of family secrets and personal tragedies. He knew that the decisions he would make over the next few days would not only affect Patricia and Mariah, but potentially thousands of lives that depended on the promised donation. As the night progressed, three restless souls, Patricia, Mariah, and Judge Mendez, contemplated the past and the future, each knowing that the next day's revelations could change everything again. The sun would rise in a few hours, bringing with it a new day and perhaps a chance for redemption, and a fresh start for the Sinclair family. The dawn in San Francisco brought with it a frenetic energy. As the city awoke to another busy day, Mariah Johnson found herself in a completely new world. Sitting in a small meeting room downtown, Mariah looked nervously at the faces around her. Carlos Oliveira, a gray-haired lawyer with kind eyes, smiled encouragingly at her. Next to him, Luisa Mendonça, a young activist with colorful dreads and a laptop covered in stickers, was typing furiously. "So, Mariah," Carlos began, his voice calm and reassuring, "do you understand why we're here today?" Mariah nodded hesitantly. Do you want to help me with the Sinclair case?" Luisa stopped typing, her eyes shining with determination. "Not just to help you, Mariah. We want to use this case to make a real change in the city." Carlos nodded, elaborating. "You see, the social justice movement has been closely following the homeless situation in San Francisco for years. Ms. Sinclair's donation is a unique opportunity to make a significant difference." Mariah frowned, a knot forming in her stomach. "But I don't want to use my connection with Patricia to my advantage. She's my family, even after all these years." Luisa leaned forward, her expression serious. "Nobody's talking about taking advantage, Mariah. We're talking about ensuring that this donation is used as effectively as possible. And who better to guide that than someone who has lived on the streets?" Luisa's words resonated with Mariah. For the first time in years, she felt a greater purpose than simply surviving from day to day. "What exactly do you have in mind?" Mariah asked, her curiosity overcoming her initial hesitation. Carlos opened a folder, revealing several documents. "We have some proposals for housing programs, job training and medical assistance, but we need your perspective to refine these plans." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of discussion, planning, and, to Mariah's surprise, laughter. For the first time in a long time, she felt part of something bigger than herself. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Patricia Sinclair was facing her own battle. Sitting in her home office, she listened to Claire, her lawyer, with a mixture of frustration and determination. "Patricia, you have to understand," Claire argued. "Changing the terms of the donation now could open up a real legal minefield. Your cousins are already threatening to challenge the original donation, claiming that you're not in your right mind." Patricia stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. The panoramic view of San Francisco, which had once brought her comfort, now seemed to mock her with its vastness and complexity. "What if they're right, Claire?" Patricia whispered, her voice charged with emotion. "What if I'm acting impulsively? But how can I just ignore the fact that my cousin, my family, spent years living on the streets while I lived in this luxury?" Claire moved closer, placing a comforting hand on Patricia's shoulder. "No one's saying to ignore it. but we need to act with caution. Changing the terms of the donation to directly benefit Mariah could look like favoritism, or worse, an admission of guilt. Patricia turned, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and unshed tears. "So what do you suggest?" "Let's keep the original terms of the donation," Claire began, choosing her words carefully. "But we can create a clause that ensures that a significant portion of the funds are directed to specific programs that serve people in situations similar to Mariah's." Patricia considered the proposal for a moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, but I want to be personally involved in these programs. I can't go on living in my bubble of privilege." Claire smiled, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. "That could be risky, Patricia. You'll be exposing yourself to a lot of attention and possibly criticism." "It's a risk I'm willing to take," Patricia replied, her voice firm. "It's time to do more than just sign checks." As the day progressed, Mariah found herself getting more and more involved with the activist group. What had begun as a meeting to discuss the Sinclair case evolved into a brainstorming of ideas for systemic changes in the city. "The problem isn't just homelessness," Mariah explained, her voice gaining confidence. "It's the lack of opportunities, of access to healthcare, of dignity." Louisa nodded enthusiastically, her hands flying over the keyboard as she documented Mariah's ideas. Carlos, meanwhile, took notes on a pad, occasionally asking insightful questions that helped refine the concepts. "You know," Carlos said, looking at Mariah with admiration, "you have a natural talent for this. Have you considered getting more actively involved in activism?" Mariah paused, surprised by the suggestion. "Me? But I'm just... well, I have no formal education, no experience." Louisa interrupted, her tone passionate. "Mariah, you have something much more valuable, real-life experience. You understand the needs of the community in a way that many of us, with all our education, never could." Louisa's words touched something deep in Mariah. Years of surviving on the streets had diminished her self-esteem, making her feel invisible and worthless. But here, in this room, with these people, she felt seen, valued. I'd like that," Mariah finally said, a shy smile forming on her lips. "I'd like to help to make a difference." Carlos smiled broadly, extending his hand to Mariah. "Welcome to the team, then." While Mariah found a new purpose, Patricia struggled with her own isolation. After hours of arguing with Claire, she found herself alone in her vast apartment, the silence deafening. Walking over to her bookcase, Patricia picked up a dusty photo album. The images of happier times, family picnics, birthdays, Christmases, seemed to belong to another life. One photo in particular caught her eye. Her and Mariah, teenagers, hugging and smiling at the camera. Patricia traced the outline of Mariah's face with her finger, silent tears running down her cheeks. "How could I let this happen?" she whispered to the empty room. At that moment, Patricia made another decision. Picking up her phone, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Thomas, it's Patricia. Is your phone still blocking my calls?" On the other end of the line, her brother's voice sounded hesitant. "Pat, No, it's not. I wasn't expecting your call." "I know," Patricia replied, her voice embittered. "But Thomas, we need to talk. About everything. About that night, about Mariah, about our family." There was a long silence before Thomas answered. "Okay, Pat. I think it's about time, isn't it?" As night fell over San Francisco, new alliances were formed and old bonds were rekindled. Mariah, finding new purpose with the activists. Patricia, seeking reconnection with her estranged brother. The Sinclair case, which had begun as a simple philanthropic donation, was turning into something much bigger. A chance for healing, redemption, and perhaps real change for an entire city. As the city lights flickered on in the darkness, both Mariah and Patricia prepared themselves, each in their own way, for the challenges that the new day would bring. Court awaited them, and with it, the promise of more revelations and perhaps a new beginning for both of them. The Almeida Associados law firm was buzzing with activity that morning. Claire, sitting at her desk, was furiously leafing through a pile of newly arrived documents. Her normally composed face betrayed a mixture of shock and concern. "This can't be right," she muttered, picking up the phone. "Patricia needs to know about this immediately." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Patricia Sinclair walked nervously through the lobby of a discreet cafe. Her brother Thomas had agreed to meet her there, away from the prying eyes of the media and high society. The doorbell tinkled, and Patricia turned to see Thomas entering. The years had been kind to him. His face still bore traces of the youth Patricia remembered, although his eyes looked more tired, more cautious. "Pat," he said simply, stopping a few paces away. "Tommy," she replied, her voice breaking. For a moment they stood there, the weight of years of silence and resentment between them. Finally, Patricia stepped forward, opening her arms. Thomas hesitated for a second before embracing her, the gesture awkward but sincere. Sitting at a table at the back of the cafe, away from prying ears, the Sinclair brothers began to dig up the past. "Why now, Pat?" Thomas asked, absent-mindedly fiddling with his coffee cup. "After all these years," Patricia sighed deeply. "Mariah," she said simply, "meeting her again, knowing what she's been through." "Tommy, how could we let this happen?" Thomas frowned. "Pat, you know I tried to find her after the fire, but Uncle James disappeared with her. And you were so focused on maintaining our parents' empire." "I know," Patricia interrupted, guilt evident in her voice. I thought I was doing what Dad and Mom would have wanted, keeping the business going, keeping the family name. But at what cost, Tommy?" Thomas looked out of the window, his next words carefully chosen. "Pat, there's something you need to know about that night, something I've never told you." Patricia's heart raced. "What?" "That night, before the fire started, I heard Dad and Uncle James arguing. They were shouting about money, a lot of money." Patricia felt the blood freeze in her veins. "What are you saying, Tommy?" Before Thomas could answer, Patricia's phone rang insistently. It was Claire. "Patricia," Claire's voice sounded urgent on the other end of the line. "We need to talk, now. I found something in the company archives, something you need to see." Patricia looked at Thomas, who nodded gravely. "Go," he said. "But this isn't over. We have a lot more to discuss." In Claire's office, Patricia stared in disbelief at the documents spread out on the table. "That can't be true," she muttered, running her eyes over the numbers and dates. Claire nodded somberly. "Unfortunately, it is. It seems that your father and Uncle James were involved in a wealth concealment scheme. Millions siphoned off into offshore accounts, phantom investments." Patricia felt the world spin around her. Everything she believed about her family, about the legacy she had fought so hard to protect, was falling apart. "And there's more," Claire continued, hesitantly. "We found evidence that the fire may not have been an accident." Patricia staggered, clutching the edge of the table for support. "What?" "There are indications that it was a file burn," Claire explained softly. "Something went wrong and—" Patricia couldn't hear the rest. The roar in her ears drowned out everything around her. Years of guilt, of grief, of blind dedication to the family business, all based on a lie. While Patricia faced the shocking revelations about her past, Mariah was immersed in a whole new world. At the headquarters of the Movement for Social Justice, she found herself surrounded by city maps, statistical graphs, and determined faces. "So, if we direct funds to this area first," Louisa explained, pointing to a map, "we can create a domino effect of improvements." Mariah nodded, absorbing every detail. Her mind, sharpened by years of surviving on the streets, was quickly identifying strengths and weaknesses in the plans. "What about people who don't have papers?" she asked. "Many on the streets have lost everything, including legal identity." Carlos smiled, impressed. "Excellent point, Mariah. We need to include a legal assistance program in the plan." As the discussion progressed, Mariah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension growing inside her. Part of her still couldn't believe she was there, contributing to something so important. Another part feared that it could all disappear in the blink of an eye, as had happened so many times in her life. "Mariah," Louisa called softly, noticing her distant expression. "Is everything all right?" Mariah hesitated before answering. "It's just that it all sounds too good to be true. What if something goes wrong? What if Patricia changes her mind about the donation?" Carlos approached, his face serious but gentle. "Mariah, whatever happens with the Sinclair donation, you're part of this team now. Your knowledge, your experience, they're invaluable to us." Carlos's words warmed Mariah's heart, but a shadow of doubt lingered. "But what about Patricia? She's my family. I don't want her to think I'm using our connection to do good," Louisa added, raising an eyebrow. "Mariah, you have as much right as anyone to fight for change. Your connection with Patricia doesn't diminish that." Mariah nodded slowly, trying to believe her new friend's words. But in the back of her mind, a persistent voice whispered doubts and fears. Back in Claire's office, Patricia finally found her voice. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. Claire hesitated. "Legally, we have options. We can try to keep it a secret, protect the family name." "No," Patricia interrupted firmly. "No more secrets. No more lies." "Patricia," Claire warned, "you have to understand the implications. This could affect not only you, but the donation, the projects we have planned." Patricia stood up, walking over to the window. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that office. "Maybe," Patricia said slowly, "maybe it's time to rethink everything, not just the donation, but everything." Claire watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What did you have in mind?" Patricia turned around, her eyes shining with a new determination. "I want to do more than just donate money, Claire. I want to fix what's wrong, starting with my own family." Just then, Patricia's phone rang again. It was Thomas. "Pat," her brother's voice sounded urgent. "I've just had a call. It's about Mariah. I think she might be in danger." Patricia's heart raced. Just when she thought things couldn't get any more complicated, fate proved otherwise. "I'm on my way," she said, already heading for the door. As Patricia ran to her car, her mind was spinning with all the revelations of the day. Her family's secrets, the possible danger to Mariah, the overwhelming responsibility that now weighed on her shoulders. One thing was clear. The decisions she would make in the next few hours would not only affect her future, but that of many others. The weight of the Sinclair legacy, both good and bad, had never seemed so heavy. As the sun began to set over San Francisco, casting long shadows over the city, Patricia prepared to face perhaps the biggest challenge of her life. The truth, buried for so long, was about to come out, and with it, the chance of redemption, or total ruin. The John Madison Forum was abuzz that morning. Journalists flocked to the steps, cameras and microphones at the ready, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the protagonists of what had become the most talked about case in San Francisco. Inside the courtroom, the air was charged with tension. Judge Roberto Mendez looked gravely at the crowded courtroom, aware that the decisions made there today would have ramifications far beyond those four walls. Patricia Sinclair entered, her face pale but determined. Beside her, Claire walked with firm steps, a thick briefcase under her arm. On the other side of the room, Mariah Johnson sat with Carlos and Louisa, the nervousness evident in her restless eyes. "All rise," announced the bailiff. "This session of the court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Roberto Mendez presiding." Judge Mendez settled into his chair, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Patricia. "Miss Sinclair," he began, his deep voice echoing through the silent room, "I understand that you have new information to present to the court." Patricia stood up, her hands shaking slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. In recent days, certain revelations about my family and the Sinclair business have come to light." A murmur went through the room. Judge Mendez raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Ms. Sinclair." Patricia took a deep breath, casting a quick glance at Mariah before continuing. "We've uncovered evidence that my father and uncle were involved in a wealth concealment scheme. Millions of rials were siphoned off into offshore accounts and phantom investments." The buzz in the room increased. Mariah looked at Patricia with a mixture of shock and compassion. "Order!" Judge Mendez banged his gavel. "Miss Sinclair, these are serious charges. Do you have evidence to support these allegations?" Claire stood up, placing a stack of documents on the judge's desk. "Yes, Your Honor. These documents detail the suspicious transactions and the hidden accounts." As the judge examined the papers, Patricia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "There's more, Your Honor. We have reason to believe that the fire that killed my parents may not have been accidental." A collective shock ran through the room. Mariah put her hand to her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. Judge Mendez frowned deeply. "Miss Sinclair, do you understand the implications of what you're saying? This could lead to a criminal investigation." Patricia nodded gravely. "I understand, Your Honor, and I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation." At this point, Carlos stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, these revelations have direct implications for the donation in question. The money that Ms. Sinclair intends to donate may come from illegal activities." Judge Mendez nodded slowly. "A valid point, Mr. Oliveira. Ms. Sinclair, how do you respond to that?" Patricia closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze. "Your Honor, I didn't know the origin of these funds until recently, but that doesn't change the fact that this money can and should be used to do good. I propose that the entire Sinclair fortune be placed in a trust fund, administered by an independent board, to be used for the benefit of the city and its neediest citizens." The room erupted in chaos. Lawyers jumped out of their chairs, protesting vehemently. Journalists at the back of the room rushed for their phones, eager to be the first to report this shocking turn of events. "Order! Order in the court!" Judge Mendez banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice thundering over the tumult. When silence was finally restored, Mariah slowly stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaky but clear, "may I speak?" The judge nodded, curious. Mariah looked directly at Patricia, tears streaming silently down her face. "Patricia, I didn't know. About the fire, about the money. I spent so long resenting you, thinking that you and your family had abandoned me. But now I see we were all victims." Patricia felt her own tears start to fall. "Oh, Mariah, I'm so sorry. For everything." Mariah continued, now addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I spent years on the streets. I saw the suffering up close, the daily struggle for survival. What Patricia is proposing could change so many lives. Please don't let the mistakes of the past stand in the way of a better future." Judge Mendez listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. When Mariah had finished, he leaned back in his chair, pensive. "This case," he began slowly, "has taken a turn that none of us could have foreseen. The revelations made today are of an extremely serious nature and will certainly lead to further investigation." He paused, his gaze roaming the room. "However, Ms. Sinclair's proposal to set up an independent trust fund is intriguing. It could be a way of ensuring that these funds, regardless of their origin, are used for the common good." Claire stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to propose that the Movement for Social Justice, represented here by Mr. Oliveira and Ms. Mendonça, be included on the board that will administer this fund. Their experience and knowledge will be invaluable." Judge Mendez nodded. "A sensible suggestion. Mr. Oliveira, Ms. Mendonça, would you be willing to take on this role?" Carlos and Luisa exchanged surprised glances before nodding emphatically. "Well," the judge continued, "there are still many details to be resolved. We'll need time to examine all this new information and determine the best course of action." He banged his gavel. "This court will go into recess for 48 hours. During that time, I expect all parties involved to work together to refine this trust fund proposal. I want to see a detailed plan when we return." As the room began to empty, Patricia hesitantly approached Mariah. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, years of pain and separation weighing them down. Then, without a word, Mariah stepped forward and embraced Patricia. The gesture, simple but deeply meaningful, seemed to release years of tension and hurt. "We have a lot to talk about," Patricia whispered. Mariah nodded, pulling away with a shaky smile. Yes, we do. But right now, I think we have work to do. As they walked out of the courtroom together, closely followed by Claire, Carlos, and Luisa, there was a palpable feeling that something significant had changed. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of legal and emotional challenges. But for the first time in a long time, there was also hope. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed San Francisco in a golden light, as if the city itself was renewing itself. The revelations of that day had shaken foundations, exposed painful truths, but also opened doors to possibilities that had previously seemed unimaginable. As the group walked away from the courthouse, ready to face the next crucial 48 hours, one thing was clear. The real journey of redemption and transformation was just beginning. The sun was rising over San Francisco, bathing the city in shades of gold and pink. On the 25th floor of a corporate building downtown, Patricia Sinclair watched the metropolis awaken, its pale, tired reflection visible in the glass of her window. The last 48 hours had been a marathon of meetings, heated discussions, and intense planning. Behind her, the conference room was packed. Mariah Johnson, now dressed in borrowed but elegant clothes, was leaning over a pile of documents, talking quietly to Luisa. Carlos and Claire were in an animated discussion about the legal aspects of the new plan, while a team of accountants and lawyers worked furiously on laptops spread across the large mahogany table. "Everyone ready?" Patricia asked, turning to face the group. Heads nodded in unison. It was time to return to the courthouse. The John Madison Forum was even more chaotic than 2 days ago. News of the shocking revelations about the Sinclair family had spread like wildfire, attracting an even larger crowd of journalists, onlookers, and activists. Inside the courtroom, Judge Roberto Mendez watched the scene with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. When everyone was in their seats, he banged his gavel, calling the session to order. "Well," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, "these have undoubtedly been 2 of the most extraordinary days in my legal career. Miss Sinclair, I understand that you and your team have a proposal to present to the court?" Patricia stood up, her face a mask of determination. "Yes, Your Honor. For the past 2 days, we have worked tirelessly to develop a plan that we believe is not only fair, but truly transformative." She gestured, and Claire began handing out folders to the judge and the others present. "What we propose," Patricia continued, "is the creation of the New Dawn Foundation. This foundation will be funded with the entirety of the Sinclair family's assets, including all businesses and properties." A murmur of surprise went through the room. Judge Mendez raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "The foundation will be managed by an independent board, made up of experts in areas such as social housing, education, public health, and urban development. Mariah Johnson and I will serve as co-chairs, but we won't have veto power over the board's decisions." Mariah stood up, joining Patricia. Her voice, once hesitant, now sounded strong and confident. "The goal of the New Dawn Foundation will be twofold. First, to address the root causes of poverty and inequality in San Francisco. Second, to develop innovative programs that can be replicated in other cities in America and around the world." Carlos stepped forward, taking the floor. "Your Honor, if I may elaborate on the legal aspects, the structure we are proposing will guarantee total transparency and accountability. There will be regular independent audits and all the reports will be in the public domain." Judge Mendez leafed through the documents, his face a mask of concentration. "That's extraordinary," he muttered. Raising his eyes, he addressed Patricia. "Miss Sinclair, do you understand that you are essentially giving up your personal fortune?" Patricia nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor. But what I'm gaining, the chance to make a real difference, to right the wrongs of the past, is worth far more than any bank account." The judge turned to Mariah. "And you, Mrs. Johnson? How do you feel about all this?" Mariah smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Your Honor, I spent years on the streets feeling invisible and worthless. Now I have the opportunity to ensure that no one else has to go through that. It's more than I could ever have dreamed of." Judge Mendez leaned back in his chair, pensive. For long moments, the room was in tense silence, all eyes fixed on him. Finally, he leaned forward. In my years in the judiciary, I have seen many things. Bitter disputes over inheritances, legal battles that tear families apart. But this is something different. He paused, a small smile forming on his lips. What you're proposing here is more than just a legal resolution. It's a chance for redemption, for transformation not just for you, but for an entire city. The judge picked up his gavel, but hesitated before slamming it down. Before I give my final decision, is there anyone else who would like to speak? To everyone's surprise, a figure stood up at the back of the room. It was Thomas, Patricia's brother. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I'd like to add something to my sister's plan." Patricia looked at her brother, confused but hopeful. Thomas walked to the front of the room, stopping next to Patricia and Mariah. "In recent years, I've distanced myself from the Sinclair family and business. I've built my own fortune separate from the family assets. Today I want to donate half of that fortune to the New Dawn Foundation." Tears streamed down Patricia's face as she hugged her brother. Mariah, after a moment's hesitation, joined in the embrace. Judge Mendez watched the scene with a gentle smile. When the three separated, he finally banged his gavel. "It is the decision of this court that the New Dawn Foundation's proposal be approved. May it serve as a model of how wealth and privilege can be used for the greater good." The room erupted in applause. Patricia, Mariah, and Thomas hugged again, their tears now of joy and relief. In the months that followed, San Francisco saw unprecedented changes. The New Dawn Foundation launched ambitious social housing, education, and public health programs. Mariah, with her experience of life on the streets, became a powerful voice in defending the rights of the homeless and marginalized. Patricia, freed from the weight of family secrets and expectations, discovered a new passion for working directly with the communities the foundation helped. Thomas, reconciled with his sister, brought his business expertise to ensure the long-term sustainability of the foundation's projects. A year after the historic court decision, the New Dawn Foundation held an event to celebrate its early successes and launch new projects. On stage, Patricia, Mariah, and Thomas stood side by side, their faces beaming with pride and purpose. Mariah stepped forward to speak, her clear, confident voice echoing through the packed auditorium. "A year ago, I was invisible. Today, I stand before you not just as a survivor, but as someone who has the power to make a difference. The New Dawn Foundation is not just about giving money or building houses. It's about restoring dignity, about seeing the potential in every human being." Patricia then took the floor. "The Sinclair legacy has always been defined by wealth and power. Today, we have redefined that legacy. It's no longer about what we can accumulate, but what we can give. It's not about building walls, it's about building bridges." Thomas concluded, "The true test of a society is not how it treats its most privileged members, but how it looks after the most vulnerable. With the New Dawn Foundation, we are committed to creating a San Francisco and an America where no one is left behind." As the audience gave them a standing ovation, Patricia, Mariah, and Thomas hugged each other once more. They knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but for the first time in their lives, they felt that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Outside, the sun was setting over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city, so often divided by inequality, seemed united in a moment of hope and possibility. And at the heart of this transformation were three people who had discovered that true wealth lies not in bank accounts or property, but in the ability to make a difference in the lives of others. As the city lights began to flicker in the falling night, the promise of a new dawn hung in the air, not just for the Sinclair family, but for an entire city ready to embrace a fairer and more compassionate future. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.